Well, we always talk about cellular respiration as though it's a chemical reaction. In reality, it's a very long, complex series of chemical reactions. So is oxidative phosphorylation. It's not one reaction. It's a long series of reactions. And these particular types of metabolic reactions, the kind that you find in cellular respiration and in oxidative phosphorylation, these are called oxidation reduction reactions or redox reactions. We need to learn a few of the details about oxidation reduction reactions because they are so critical to microbial metabolism. The first thing to know is that oxidation reduction reactions always occur in pairs. In other words, something will be oxidized and something else will be reduced during this chemical reaction. Oxygen and the other molecules we've talked about, like nitrate, sulfate, etc., those are what we called the final electron acceptors at the end of the electron transport chain. Those molecules are getting reduced. They are gaining electrons, the electrons that are sort of walking down or being sent down the staircase that is the electron transport chain. They need to go somewhere. They need to be received by a molecule. And that reception, that gaining of those electrons is reduction. So the simple sugar that goes into cellular respiration, whether it's glucose or maybe sucrose or maybe mannose or lactose, that sugar gets broken down all the way to a one carbon molecule called carbon dioxide. That sugar is losing its electrons. As its covalent bonds get broken, the electrons are being released. That molecule is losing electrons, and we call that oxidation. So when we say that the sugar gets broken down in cellular respiration, we can also say the sugar gets oxidized. It loses electrons. Remember, cellular respiration is not one reaction. It's not one oxidation. It's a series of oxidations. Each bond that gets broken releases a pair of electrons. That's an oxidation. Remember too that we said oxidation always occurs with reduction. So cellular respiration is a series of oxidation, reduction, oxidation, reduction. Something gets oxidized, something else gets reduced. Something new gets oxidized, then something else gets reduced. It's a long series of oxidation reduction reactions to take a sugar and break it down to carbon dioxide. Ultimately, that molecule that sits at the end of the electron transport chain is the last piece of it, the last thing, and it gets reduced. And all of this elaborate microbial metabolism, all of this is directed to the goal of making ATP. ATP, remember, is what we sometimes call the energy currency of living cells because it's a critical molecule for the short-term storage of energy. And I wrote PE on your slide here to remind us that when we put energy into a covalent bond, when we build a covalent bond, we are storing energy in that bond. Because there's a pair of electrons in there, and because electrons are the conduits of energy, by building a covalent bond, we have stored some energy, and we call that potential energy. Energy that's stored in a bond is potential. It's potentially available to the cell at a later time. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has some energy stored in particular in those phosphate bonds, the triphosphate, the 3-phosphate bonds. In the cell, we can break off the outermost phosphate group and we can release the energy in that bond. Remember, that's how ATP gets used in a cell. It's there to provide energy when energy is needed. So, what happens in cellular respiration and oxidative phosphorylation is a whole lot of ATP gets made for the cell to use. And the way the cell uses it is by breaking off that outer phosphate group and releasing a little energy, and then building the ATP back up, and then breaking it down, and then building it up, and breaking it down, and building it up. In other words, the ATP molecule is used to couple the different categories of metabolic reactions that are going on in the cell. ATP is used to couple exergonic reactions with endergonic reactions, the reactions that are releasing energy with the reactions that require energy. ATP is the middleman. Cells are very thrifty. Cells do not store large amounts of ATP. There's only enough ATP inside a living cell to last for several minutes. Cells, therefore, have to be able to make ATP very quickly as they need it, as their energy needs change throughout the day. So let's spend a couple of minutes thinking about this coupling, thinking about how energy moves around in a cell, how it flows in a cell. All living cells have to do work every day. All living cells are constantly metabolizing, and that is work. Building bonds, breaking bonds, it's work, and it has to be done 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Remember that energy is stored inside all of the covalent bonds in all of the molecules inside a cell. And inside that covalent bond is a pair of electrons. That's what the covalent bond is. It's a pair of electrons that are being shared between two atoms. So as covalent bonds get broken during catabolic metabolism, electrons get released. And when electrons get released, they move. So we talk about electrons traveling in what you can think of as an energy pathway in a cell. When a bond gets broken, the electrons get released, they flow, they move until they are then put back into a new covalent bond between two atoms. This image over here on the right-hand side of the slide just reminds us what a covalent bond is. Here we see two atoms of carbon, and we can see the atomic nucleus in the green area. And then we see these concentric rings around the atomic nucleus. Those rings represent shells or collections of orbitals that contain electrons. The electrons are buzzing all around the atomic nucleus all the time, but they are located in these discrete sort of layers or shells around the atomic nucleus. The valence shell is the outermost shell, and sometimes the valence shell contains an unpaired electron, as shown in this diagram. When two atoms have this problem, an unpaired electron in their valence shell, they can come together and they can share their unpaired electrons. So now both of them have a pair in their valence shell. So inside that covalent bond, there's a pair of electrons. One of them comes from one atom and the other comes from the other atom. And when they come together like this, now they share them. Now they're both more stable than they would be with an unpaired electron. Most metabolic reactions whether you're talking about catabolic reactions or anabolic reactions. Most metabolic reactions are this oxidation reduction type of reaction. And we have to have a clear understanding of which is which. What is oxidation? What is reduction? We've said now that when we break a bond, a covalent bond, and the electrons get released, that's oxidation. So that means that reduction is the opposite. Reduction is when an atom gains electrons. Oxidation is when they lose electrons. Now, there are actually several different very clever little mnemonic devices that people use to remind themselves which one is which. The one that I would like us to learn is Leo goes grr. Leo goes grr. Leo means loss or lose electrons, oxidation, and grr means gain electrons, reduction. Remember, these are always coupled. So in a chemical reaction, if one molecule is losing electrons, in other words, if bonds are being broken, then on the other side of the equation, another molecule must be gaining electrons. Bonds are being built. Oxidation and reduction always go together. They're always coupled. This is also a good time to remind ourselves of the first law of thermodynamics. We're talking about energy flowing around in a cell, being released here and then being put into another molecule, bonds being broken, bonds being built. We need to remind ourselves what the first law of thermodynamics tells us. As energy moves around in a cell with these particles called electrons, what's happening is that energy is being converted from one form to another. If it starts off as, potential energy, a pair of electrons in a covalent bond, when those electrons get released, that energy gets transformed or converted into other types of energy. Along the way, as electrons flow around in a cell, their energy gets used. It gets used to do the work of the cell. This is a good place for us to stop.